Good evening, and thank you for joining me tonight. Tonight, I want to tell you a story. It's the story of Brussels. But wait, don't turn it off just yet. This isn't one of those boring European Union bureaucracy stories we know, with diplomats in suits wandering around gray corridors. Quite the opposite. This is the story of one of the biggest strategic miscalculations of recent years. A moment of panic, a blackmail attempt, and how that blackmail literally blew up in the perpetrators' faces. This is Brussels, the political heart of NATO and the European Union. And just a few days ago, the skies above this city were locked in chaos, heralding something far more than a show of force, a deep panic. Now, I want you to picture that moment in your mind. It's nighttime. You're at Brussels Airport. You're in one of Europe's busiest, most central terminals. Thousands of people are rushing to different gates, waiting to reunite with loved ones or make it to an important meeting. And suddenly, everything stops. Flights are canceled. Runways are closed. Because there are things in the sky that shouldn't be there. Small, buzzing, unidentified drones. This is a psychological attack designed to trigger civilian panic. A message saying, I can get right into your home. But this was just the tip of the iceberg. At the same time, the same buzzing sounds were heard over Liège Airport. Why is this important? Because Liège is one of Europe's busiest cargo hubs. And since the beginning of the war, it has been one of the key logistical points for military aid going to Ukraine. The message here is even clearer. I know your supply chains, and I can disrupt them whenever I want. And just when you're thinking, what else could there be? The real message was delivered to the most dangerous target. Those drones were spotted over Florennes Air Base, home to Belgium's F-35 fighter jets. A warning to NATO's most advanced air power. And the fourth most dangerous target, Kleine Brugel Air Base. Make a note of that name. This is not just any military base. It is one of the most sensitive military points on the continent, allegedly hosting U.S. tactical nuclear weapons as part of the nuclear sharing program in Europe. Imagine this. Drones suspected of being of Russian origin are flying around the heart of NATO's nuclear deterrent. The real question here is why? Why such a reckless, risky move? The answer lies in the timing. Just before these drones appeared in Brussels skies, the European Union was on the verge of seizing Putin's war chest, the interest income from billions of dollars of frozen Russian assets. Literally, Putin's wallet was about to be set on fire. The Kremlin's plan was perhaps simple on paper. If you take the money, I'll burn your house down. Terrorize the heart of NATO. Create chaos by locking down civilian airports. Fly drones over nuclear bases to send the message, look how far I can go. And wait for the decision makers in Brussels to say, this is too much. Let's forget the money and back down. It was blackmail. But this plan turned into one of the most spectacular, most epic strategic blunders of recent years. The blackmail blew up in his face the moment it began. While Putin waited for a fearful, panicked phone call from Brussels, the response came from somewhere else entirely, in a completely different tone. Instead of backing down, Brussels put one of the most serious cards in the NATO treaty on the table. Article 4. Now, most of us know Article 5. An attack on one of us is considered an attack on all of us. This is not that. Article 4 is perhaps more interesting. Article 4 requires all allies to convene for urgent consultation when the territorial integrity, political independence, or security of a member state is threatened. This means they are attacking me. Let's decide together what to do. And this is the step before the famous Article 5. While attempting economic blackmail, Putin suddenly found himself creating a military threat that triggered NATO's collective security clause. He became a victim of his own bluff. And that Article 4 meeting could be much more than a boring diplomatic consultation in Brussels. According to behind-the-scenes information, the decisions coming out of that meeting could fundamentally change all of the alliance's rules of engagement towards Russia's shadow fleet. This is something that really amazes me. The era of observe and report could officially end with these provocations. It could be replaced by an order to hunt and stop. What does that mean? Consider this. NATO Standing Maritime Group 1, SNMG-1, patrolling the North Atlantic and the Baltic Sea. Those glorious German Saxon-class frigates, Danish Iver Huitfeldt-class destroyers, Norwegian P-8, Poseidon Maritime Patrol aircraft, scanning the area from the air. All of them could now classify those rusty, sanctions-evading shadow tankers not just as smugglers, but as potential Trojan horses. Because, as I will explain shortly, it is suspected that these ships no longer carry only oil, but also drones. The new doctrine may be brutally simple. The slightest electronic or visual evidence that these ships are sabotaging critical submarine energy and internet cables or involved in any hybrid operation could trigger not a civilian inspection, but direct military intervention. This means NATO warships could have the authority to board, search, and immediately seize these militarized civilian ships if evidence is found. Such a move could paralyze Putin's strategy of threatening Europe with his shadow fleet. By effectively turning the Baltic Sea into a NATO lake, it could trap Putin's hybrid warfare apparatus in a strategic strangulation before it even becomes operational. That is how serious a diplomatic fiasco the triggering of Article 4 was. But that was only the diplomatic response. The military response came not from Brussels, where Putin was waiting for a phone call, but directly from Berlin, via a cargo plane. If Article 4 was a diplomatic challenge, the military response came immediately. Germany saw this blackmail and did not hesitate. The German Air Force, or Luftwaffe, immediately dispatched its most elite CUAS, or drone defense experts, to Belgium. These men are elite units within the Luftwaffe's Object-Schutz Regiment, or Facility Protection Regiment. Their mission is to hunt down enemy UAVs using advanced jammers like the HP-47 and other detection systems. The significance of this move is this: Germany, NATO's greatest power, considered this gray zone threat against an ally as a threat to its own national security and intervened militarily. What did Putin's blackmail achieve? It modernized NATO's drone defense overnight. It unwittingly gifted Europe a perfect excuse to establish a new and faster drone defense force, triggered by its own actions. This is a strategic own goal situation. So how did we get to this point? That's the question that really puzzles me. What was the real reason that pushed Putin into such a risky, such a foolish blackmail move? Why did the issue of frozen assets cause him to take the risk of harassing a nuclear base? The answer is simple: because this move in Belgium was not part of a strategy, but a product of desperation. This was Putin's last card, because on all other fronts, Russia had been experiencing an unprecedented strategic suffocation over the past 2 months. The lifelines of the war machine were being cut one by one. This incident in Belgium is not an isolated case. It was the culmination of a systematic hybrid harassment model that had been escalating for the past 2 months, starting in the Baltic Sea. Putin's strategy of testing nerves had already begun in the Baltics in September. It all started in September with the closure of Copenhagen Airport due to similar drone harassment. The incident was so serious that Denmark deepened its investigation, and suspicions focused on one of those infamous shadow fleet tankers Putin uses to evade sanctions. The suspected vessel? Pushpa, or Boracay. This sounds like the plot of a Cold War thriller, doesn't it? But it's not. It's happening right now. Allegedly, this tanker was used as a sea platform to launch drones from a position near the Danish coast to lock down a NATO country's civilian airport. The suspicion was so serious that French naval commandos took action. In Danish waters, they intervened with a military operation against the Pushpa tanker on suspicion of this hybrid attack against the civilian infrastructure of a NATO country, and seized the ship. This incident also means that Putin's shadow fleet is now recognized not only as a tool for circumventing economic sanctions, but also as a military asset used against NATO. Putin has handed NATO the justification it needed to hunt down his shadow fleet on a silver platter. Almost simultaneously, on September 19th, 3 armed Russian MiG-31 fighter jets violated Estonian airspace for a full 12 minutes. This was no accident. It was a deliberate provocation to test the response time of NATO's Baltic air policing mission. The response was swift. Italian F-35 jets stationed in the region immediately took off and intercepted the armed Russian jets at the NATO border. These tests, conducted by drone from the sea in Denmark and by fighter jet from the air in Estonia, were a harbinger of the harassment of the nuclear base in Belgium. Putin tried to test NATO's resolve and found a tougher wall each time. And of course, while these military provocations were taking place, the propaganda machine was not idle. Dmitry Medvedev took the stage, as usual. Medvedev threatened to literally completely destroy Belgium in a statement he made on November 1st, immediately after the drone incidents in Belgium. This is the Kremlin's classic strategy. When failing militarily on the ground, try to win at the table with nuclear threats. But this bluff is no longer fooling anyone, especially the Russian people. On one side, there is Medvedev, threatening to destroy Belgium, the heart of NATO. On the other side, there is a bitter reality. For 14 months, the Russian army has been unable to capture even Pokrovsk, a small Ukrainian town with a population of only 50,000. Which Russian citizen can ignore this contradiction? While their leaders talk about striking the U.S. coast with Poseidon torpedoes, their armies have been stuck in a town for months. This huge gap shows how meaningless Putin's and Medvedev's words have become to the Russian people. Putin's efforts to win allies are just as tragicomic. During the same days, who do you think Medvedev was meeting with in Sochi? A group of politicians from Germany's far-right AfD party. The only allies Putin and his regime can find are Europe's marginalized, far-right figures. This is not the diplomatic portrait of a world power, but of an isolated pariah state. The propaganda front cannot cover up the failures on the ground. On the contrary, it makes them even more visible. But all this comes back to the main question. Why Brussels? The propaganda has failed. The military provocations have backfired. But the real reason is that the lifeblood of the war machine has been cut off, one by one, over the last 2 months. One of the most strategic strikes of the war took place on November 2nd. The Ukrainian Security Service and Navy struck Russia's Tuapse oil refinery with long-range kamikaze drones. Imagine the scene. Tuapse, Russia's only oil refinery on the Black Sea coast, one of its busiest export hubs. And suddenly, that massive facility is engulfed in flames. The result of the attack is a complete disaster. Officials reported that oil exports from the port had completely stopped. This meant the severing of Russia's main fuel pipeline to China, Malaysia, and Turkey. Within just a few days, billions of dollars in revenue evaporated. Putin's war machine was being choked off from the south. While this was happening in the south, the Baltic lock was tightening in the north. On October 31st, Lithuania made a strategic decision to halt the transit of Russian oil products to Kaliningrad by rail. Consider Kaliningrad, Russia's fortress in the middle of Europe, cut off from the mainland. Its only supply route passes through Lithuania and Poland. Poland and the Baltic countries had already largely closed their land borders. Now, Lithuania is cutting off this last oil transit. Critically weakened Kaliningrad's military and civilian supply lines. Putin's Baltic stronghold became a logistically choked island, left to fend for itself. And finally, following the Pushpa incident in Denmark, scrutiny of Putin's shadow fleet has reached a brutal level in the Gulf of Finland and the Baltic Sea. Those mysterious tankers have now become military targets to be hunted by NATO navies. Ships can no longer leave the port of St. Petersburg. The Gulf of Finland has become a giant parking lot for Russian tankers. The capacity of the St. Petersburg port and refineries has halved because they cannot find ships to sell their oil. Now let's put it all together. The only refinery in the Black Sea, Tuapse, gone. His Baltic stronghold, Kaliningrad, shut down. His shadow fleet to transport oil, trapped. That's why Putin panicked. That's why he took such a foolish, reckless risk to access those frozen assets in Belgium, that last remaining money. The drones in Brussels were not the product of a strategy, but of the desperation created by this strategic suffocation. Ultimately, Putin's Brussels blackmail was one of his last gray zone cards, and that card blew up in his face in front of the whole world. While trying to scare and divide Europe, he sharpened NATO's collective defense reflexes. Not only did he fail to recover his frozen assets, but he also unwittingly gifted NATO a new and faster drone defense doctrine. Putin's hybrid war strategy was stopped by a shield of his own making in the skies over Brussels. So who paid the price for this fiasco? We learned our lesson from this incident, but there is a greater meaning here. As always, the bill was footed by ordinary Russian citizens. Putin's hybrid warfare in the Baltics, Denmark, and now Belgium was the last straw that broke the European Union's patience. The EU has raised Schengen visa restrictions for Russian citizens to the highest level. What does this mean? It means that millions of ordinary Russian citizens are now physically isolated from Europe. It means waiting in line for months in front of consulates, undergoing the most stringent checks, and probably still being rejected. Countries like the Baltic states and Poland had already almost completely stopped issuing visas. The border gates were closed. Now, with Putin's latest move, the last gates to Europe for Russian citizens are closing. There is no land passage, flights are restricted, and now visas are effectively canceled. Putin and his allies' actions have isolated their own people from Europe. The Russian people are trapped in consulates and airports because of their leader's war. I leave you with this thought: an army that has failed to take Pokrovsk in 14 months on the ground, a ridiculous propaganda machine spewing nuclear threats, and millions of innocent people excluded from all of Europe because of a blackmail attempt to recover their leader's frozen funds. Every move Putin and his allies make in desperation directly impacts their own people. This is a subject that truly amazes me because it shows that modern warfare is not limited to front lines, tanks, and trenches. It proves that the real war is often fought thousands of miles away in economic lifelines, pipelines, and ports. What I want to tell you tonight is the story of how the economic backbone of a country, once called an energy superpower, was targeted. It is the story of how the great assumption underlying Vladimir Putin's war in 2022, namely economic resilience, was undermined. When Putin started this war, he believed he had a plan B against Western sanctions: oil and gas. That unshakable belief in the Kremlin, the belief that Russia was an energy superpower and that this power would protect it from any restrictions. To bring this power to the world, they built a massive shadow fleet. Hundreds, perhaps thousands of ships, unidentified, uninsured, old tankers. A ghost armada roaming the oceans to circumvent sanctions and finance the war machine. And there were two main gateways through which this massive financial operation, this shadow fleet, opened up to the world. Two strongholds in the north, Putin's hometown of St. Petersburg, Leningrad, and the Baltic coast. In the south, the Black Sea ports. And according to Putin, these strongholds were impregnable. They were protected by S-400s, Panzers, and the Baltic and Black Sea fleets. They were thousands of kilometers behind the front lines. The shutdown of these ports and refineries was the Kremlin's worst nightmare because it meant the war budget would be wiped out. And Ukraine implemented a long-term, two-stage economic strangulation plan to turn this nightmare scenario into reality. Their strategy, in my view, was surprisingly simple: systematically eliminate these two main arteries sustaining Putin's war economy, these two strongholds, one after the other. What was their goal? Just to cut billions of dollars? No, I think it was deeper than that. The goal was to debunk Putin's big economic stability lie to his own people by setting those very strongholds on fire. To understand how systematic and patient this operation was, we first need to go back to September 2025 to see how the North fell. It all began in September, far from the noise of war, in Leningrad Oblast, Putin's homeland. The Ukrainian Security Service launched coordinated and highly specific attacks on the northern fortress. The first target was the Primorsk oil port, hit on September 12th. Now, Primorsk is no ordinary place. It is one of Russia's largest oil ports, the final stop on the Baltic pipeline system. Its annual capacity exceeds 58 million tons. That's an incredible figure. So where did the Ukrainian drones strike? A warehouse? An empty area? No. Reports and SBU sources confirm that the strike targeted the main pumping stations and loading infrastructure where the shadow fleet ships are loaded. Do you know what that means? It means blocking the main artery leading to the heart. Without those pumping stations, oil cannot be transferred from the pipeline to the tanker. Those massive tankers, worth billions of dollars, would be forced to sit in that port as empty piles of metal. With this strike, Ukraine crippled Russia's main export capacity in the Baltic. In a single night, shipments stopped. This was a massive slap in the face to Putin's energy superpower image, delivered right in his own backyard. But they didn't stop there. A second blow to the northern fortress was on the way. Just 2 days later, on September 14th, Ukrainian drones targeted the massive Kirishi oil refinery in the Leningrad region. The details of this attack, in my opinion, show how cleverly the operation was planned. According to a Reuters report at the time, the target was not just any random corner of the facility, but the main technical unit that provided approximately 40% of the refinery's total annual capacity. Let's think about what this means. Ukraine is not only preventing Russia from selling crude oil, it also prevents it from processing crude oil into much more profitable products such as diesel, gasoline, and jet fuel. What does this 40% capacity loss mean? First, less export revenue. Refined products are much more expensive than crude oil. This means a sharp cut in the profit margin that goes into Putin's war budget. Second, Kirishi does not only work for exports, it also meets the gasoline and diesel needs of all of Northwest Russia, including St. Petersburg. This blow is one that ordinary Russian citizens will feel at the gas station. This is Putin's "the war is far away" narrative being debunked by the gas pump itself. And third, the diesel and jet fuel produced by these refineries also goes to Russian tanks and aircraft in Ukraine. By the end of September, the picture was this. The northern fortress, meaning Primorsk and Kirishi, was badly wounded. The Baltic Gateway was closed. So what did this situation force Putin and the massive state oil pipeline monopoly Transneft to do? The predictable thing, put all their eggs in one basket. They had to urgently shift all export operations, all Shadow Fleet logistics, to the Black Sea, namely the ports of Tuapse and Novorossiysk, the southern fortress. The southern fortress suddenly became the sole lifeline of the Russian economy. For Putin, this place was no longer just vital, it was indispensable. The Black Sea Fleet and air defense systems were ordered to protect this area at all costs. However, what Putin failed to realize, in my opinion, was that this was not a strategic retreat, but the first step toward the second phase of a trap set by Ukraine. And so the second phase of the game began. The entire burden now rested on the Black Sea. Ukrainian intelligence closely monitored the Russians' panicked logistical shift step by step. The target, Tuapse, one of the most important points of the southern fortress. When the northern ports were hit, Tuapse's importance increased exponentially. It became one of the main exit points for Russian oil exports. Russian propaganda claimed that the Black Sea Fleet and air defense systems protected this area like a fortress, and that it was impossible for Ukrainian naval drones to pass through Crimea and reach this location. And then November 2nd, 2025 arrived, just 8 days before the final strike on November 10th. I want you to picture this moment. Satellite images clearly show the destruction left by the first attack on the port of Tuapse, images taken by Planet Labs and shared by tankertrackers.com. The jet black oil drifting from the docks where the Chai and Coastbuster tankers were moored. The orange containment booms spread across the sea. This first attack was a preparatory strike. Ukraine tested the port's defenses, destroyed the piers, and most importantly, inflicted heavy damage on a critical pipeline facility, the Transneft facility. The damage was so extensive that thousands of tons of crude oil leaked into the Black Sea. This was not only an economic disaster, but also an ecological one. This first attack had already reduced Tuapse's operational capacity to below 50%. So what did the Russians do? That is the real question here. And if you ask me, they fell right into the trap the Ukrainians had set for them. Panic. Billions of dollars in exports came to a sudden halt. The war machine urgently needed money, and they did the predictable thing. In a panic, they immediately began repairs to salvage the facility's reputation and Putin's invincible image. Pressure was put on the teams at Chernomor Transneft, the Tuapse terminal operator, to repair the damage in record time. They started working day and night. They rushed to repair the pipelines and get the port back online. They sent their best engineers, most expensive equipment, and all their resources to Tuapse to repair the damaged Transneft pipeline and Pier 167. The Russians thought Ukraine wouldn't strike the same spot twice. This was a hubristic reflection of that classic Russian military doctrine. It was a huge mistake. They probably temporarily relaxed the air defense systems in that section of the facility during the repair work, or at least focused all their attention on the repairs. And right at that moment, Ukrainian intelligence knew that the moment they had been waiting for months had arrived. Now let's go back to the night of November 10th. Imagine that moment. Russian engineers were about to finish the repairs, or thought they had finished. At night, Ukrainian naval drones gliding through the darkness of the Black Sea. They struck the same point being repaired, Pier 167, and the Transneft facilities, this time with much greater force. Do you know what was waiting at that pier? Tankers loaded with crude oil and fuel ready for shipment. This attack targeted not just a pier, but a vital loading facility for Putin's shadow fleet and millions of dollars worth of oil. This, in my opinion, is military genius, an intelligence triumph, and flawless timing. This is a double cost. This is a double humiliation. The Ukrainians destroyed not only millions of dollars worth of equipment and oil, but also the millions of rubles, expertise, and time spent on that repair. They sent Putin and his oligarchs this message: everything you try to repair, we will destroy again and again. This attack is a dagger plunged into the heart of Putin's shadow fleet operation in the Black Sea. As of November 10th, the port of Tuapse is closed. Without that pier, without that pipeline, tankers cannot be loaded. The tap on billions of dollars in oil revenue has been turned off from the south. But oil money wasn't the only target of the coordinated attack on November 10th. This shows how layered and deep the incident is. That same night, almost simultaneously with the explosions in Tuapse, drones reached Jankoy in northern Crimea. The target? A massive 330 kilovolt electrical substation. This is no ordinary substation. Jankoy is Crimea's main logistical and military hub. This substation supplied power not only to civilian settlements, but also to the railway electrical systems that run military supply lines to Russia's main military airbase, the Zaporizhzhia and Kherson fronts, and the command and control centers of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. Striking this substation meant severing the nerves leading to the brain of the Russian occupation forces in Crimea. And as these nerves were severed, the arteries leading to the front were also being cut off from within. During the same days, pro-Ukrainian Atesh partisans carried out another daring sabotage operation in the heart of Crimea, near Simferopol. As confirmed by Ukrinform, this line is the main artery through which Russian forces transport ammunition, fuel, tanks, and equipment to the Kherson and Zaporizhzhia fronts. Everything coming from the Crimean Bridge is distributed to the front via this line. By destroying the rails and signal boxes, the partisans stopped the supply trains for hours, perhaps even days. In the same wave of attacks, a group of Ukrainian suicide drones struck the Hverdisky oil depot in Russian-occupied Crimea. This was one of the last remaining oil depots in Crimea. Reports were already emerging of a serious gasoline shortage in Crimea. And at the same time, infrastructure at the Lykovska train station in Russia's Rostov region was also hit. Take a look at this picture. It sounds like the plot of a Cold War thriller, doesn't it? But it's not. It's happening right now. Refineries, ports, electrical substations, train tracks, oil depots. This is a full-scale logistical strangulation operation. The reflection of this situation within Russia is also interesting. I saw reports that Russian propagandist Solovyov was very angry that there was no reaction whatsoever to the destruction of Russia's refineries. The Kremlin spokesman, meanwhile, seems unable to understand why these pieces are always hitting their targets and systematically continuing to cripple the Russian oil industry. This is a tragicomic detail, I think, showing how disconnected the system is from reality. So, what is the bigger meaning of all this? What is the philosophical outcome of this chain of events? Putin is trying to send a message to the West and his own people. Our resources are infinite. We can repair everything. We will win this war through attrition. But Ukraine is sending Putin's own people and elites the exact opposite message. Your leader cannot even protect your most valuable economic asset. We don't even have the capacity to repair it. The moment we repair it, it is destroyed again. This is not the image of a superpower, but of a helpless state. The loss of billions of dollars in export revenue is no longer a temporary problem, but a permanent disaster. The stability Putin promised his people has been reduced to ashes amid the flames at the port of Tuapse. What does the permanent closure of Tuapse mean? This, I believe, means that Russia will squeeze all its Black Sea Shadow Fleet oil operations into a single large port, namely Novorossiysk. And what has become of Novorossiysk now? It is the primary choked gap for Ukrainian attacks, a massive and singular target. Putin has, with his own hands, turned his entire economic asset into a single target. Worse still, Putin's shadow fleet is now a zombie fleet. After these attacks, are there any ship captains who will agree to go to Tuapse and soon Novorossiysk? Or more importantly, international insurance companies that will insure those ships? You cannot sail a tanker without insurance. These ports have now been declared high-risk war zones under international maritime law. Ukraine is achieving physically what the West has failed to achieve with economic sanctions. It is stopping Russian oil exports. This doesn't just hit Putin's budget, it also hits Putin's allies in India, China, and the global South. Countries waiting for that oil now see that Putin is an unreliable supplier. But for me, the real philosophical consequence is this. The entire regime Putin has built over more than 20 years was based on the doctrine that Russia is an energy superpower. He threatened Europe with gas. He tried to rein in the world with oil. He used energy as a weapon. Now Ukraine has turned that weapon back on Putin. The northern fortress and the southern fortress have been rendered useless simultaneously. This was not just a clash of armies, it was a clash of elements. And Ukraine has proven to the entire world Russia's energy superpower strategy is a paper tiger. Russia's economic strongholds are unprotected, and it is powerless to protect the main assets that finance its war budget. This is not just a military defeat. This is the collapse of Putin's entire geopolitical identity. And finally, the theme of the war coming home. The war is no longer far away for Russia, a special operation taking place on Ukrainian soil. The war is in Putin's hometown of St. Petersburg. The war is in Tuapse, right next to Sochi, where Russians go on vacation. The war is in every corner of Crimea, which they call Russian soil. I leave you with this thought. The Russian people must now ask themselves, if we cannot protect our most secure, most strategic oil ports, St. Petersburg, Tuapse, what can Putin protect? Every explosion, every burning refinery shows the Russian people the truth a little more clearly. Putin's war is not enriching Russia. It is suffocating Russia. This was the story of two castles, and both fell.